Okay, and off we go. So let me, oh, great question, Shannon, thank you. CEUs are not only available to social workers, it's just that the National Association of Social Workers, Vermont and New Hampshire chapters are the ones who are vouching for the CEU for us. So we don't have as outright the capacity to offer CEUs ourselves. We're not accredited, but they are. So it may be up to individual organizations whether they'll accept CEUs from any particular place. Some places are more strict than others. So you might want to check with your own accrediting agency as to whether they'll accept the credits, but they are open to anyone. Super good question. We're off to a great start, folks. Okay, so today we are focusing very specifically on practice. What I'd love for you to do is I emailed you just before this program began with an attachment, which is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data. I did that because in the last session, this bit.ly link worked for some people and did not for others. This bit.ly link that you see on your screen should, if you copy it, or if you just type it because it's a bit.ly, it's short enough to type. If you type it into another window, it should take you to the list of YRBS information that I want you to use for this exercise. So you can access it by typing in this bit.ly, or you can go back to your email and open the PDF or click on the Google link there. So you should have 3 options for getting a hold of it. If you are still having trouble getting a hold of that document, please let me know in the chat. I'm going to give you about a minute or so to pull that up, and then I'll give you the instructions for what we're doing with that table of data. Is there anyone who does not have access to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data table that I sent at this point? Feel free to chat. All right, seeing none, which is what we say in, the parliamentary procedure world, I will give you some introduction to the activity that we're doing here. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey, if you're not already familiar, is a survey that we give nationwide. It's operated through the CDC, and it's given primarily to high school students and often to middle school students. And it's designed to help us check in with them about what risks they might be engaging in or experiencing so that we can identify trends and help to reduce those risks and keep kids safer and more well. So that's the purpose of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. There is a base survey nationally that everyone's required to give pieces of, and then you can sort of make adjustments locally. Vermont has made some really amazing adjustments locally that allow us to track LGBTQ respondents. And so because they have added questions demographically about whether you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, heterosexual questioning unsure, or cisgender, transgender questioning unsure, we can get information from respondents based on those identities. So that's where that information is coming from. And in case you didn't already know, fun fact about the YRBS, schools are not required nationwide to take it or give it. And it is a huge data undertaking, so often it will actually be assigned to individual school districts or counties, and not everybody takes it year to year. But in the state of Vermont, because we actually have fewer students in the state of Vermont than Chicago Public Schools has in their district, we can give it to all of our students every 2 years, which gives us very reliable data. So I can tell you based on the information that I'm seeing here that overall for the past, decade or so, we have seen decreasing trends in risks for LGBT youth until this survey. So this survey is the first one that has been, this survey was given in 2019, so it's 2019 data, and it's the first survey in a while where the risks for LGBT youth have gone back up instead of coming down. We have some theories about that. Some of them are mostly to do with kind of the national climate around, folks who have marginalized identities, but our hope is that having these conversations now will help equip people with the things they need to help us bring risk back down for the youth who might be in your services. So what I would like you to do with this information is an individual reflection. I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes. I'd like you to look over the data, let it sink in a little bit, and then respond to the 3 questions that you see on the screen in front of you. 1, what strikes you as you read the information? 2, if you have areas of specialization, like say substance dependency or family practice, how might you see them reflected specifically here? And what are 2 actionable takeaways for your practice based on these statistics? What are 2 things that you could imagine doing or changing, shifting about your current practice based on the information that you're seeing here? So I'll give you those moments, and then we're going to have some selective share back. Go ahead. Little 1-minute warning here, just to tell you where we are in our time schedule. And remember, these are individual reflections, so they're things that strike you, and we'll do the share after you've had a second to do this processing. All right, coming back together now. I noticed a couple of comments in the chat, so I just want to speak to those for a moment. One of the things that's mentioned specifically is the rate of youth who identify as having a disability, either physical, long-term health problem, emotional problem, learning disability. What I can tell you is that there isn't any better breakout than that. They are all lumped together, and we barely have that question. So one of the areas that the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, in my opinion, could use some adjusting, and the nice thing is that they ask for, every 2 years when they're redoing the survey, they ask for input. It's not a great capture of the specific needs of students who have disabilities. And we know that statistically, those students are likely impacted differently by the environment around them than students who don't have a disability of some sort. So that's information that's useful to know. Overall, the information that we really capture in the YRBS is in the traditional gender binary, we capture females and males. We capture now LGBT. So we are able to separate LGB and T. They're put together in this information and in the full report, but technically, since the T is a separate data point, it is possible to separate it out. It's just not doesn't tend to be publicly reported. And then we can also track youth of color and white students. So that information helps us to make comparisons between groups that have a dominant identity and groups that have a marginalized identity. And no surprise, across the board, our youth who have marginalized identities are experiencing more risk and engaging in more risk, which makes this work that we're doing super important. So I'd love to spend some time focusing specifically on that third question. As you were looking at this data, what are 2 actionable takeaways, or even 1 actionable takeaway for your practice based on these statistics? And what I mean by actionable takeaway is, what is a shift that you can make in your practice, or a change that you could imagine in your approach that is responsive to the information that you're seeing here? And you can share it in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and participate that way. I'm going to come out of screen sharing so that we can see each other's faces, if we so desire. So go ahead, share what is your actionable takeaway, either in the chat or out loud. And Joanna says, create GSAs at earlier ages, which is absolutely a great idea. One of the reasons that we get to the point that we do is that we often don't do early enough interventions with youth. Something that's valuable for us to keep in mind is that gender identity is crystallized in typically developing humans between ages of 2 and 4. So if you've got a client who is over the age of 2 and they have an opinion on their gender identity, it is very likely a pretty solid crystallized idea that's starting to emerge. So that's information that we often don't recognize in younger kiddos, that their sexuality, their romantic attractions, their gender formation are already happening when they're little, and it doesn't take much at all for them to start thinking and comparing with the rest of the world and deciding if they think that they are normal and okay, or that if something is not like everyone else, and they start picking up on that really young.
A couple of the things, I work for a designated mental health agency at NCSS, and I think we definitely, we have a zero suicide initiative anyway, but I think that's something that we need to talk about more openly with the youth that we work with, so that they feel comfortable coming to us when they're having those feelings, and making sure that we're connecting them to supports such as Outright and Friday night groups and other ways to make them feel like part of a community, so maybe they don't feel so alone.
Thank you, Heather. That's actually a great opportunity for me to plug Friday Night Group again. Friday Night Group is our Friday evening social group for LGBT youth, currently all online. When we are in person, it takes place regionally throughout the state. Right now, every Friday evening at 6:30, youth can tune in on at 6:30 in the evening on Zoom, and they can connect together. When I say youth, I mean 13 and older, like 13 up through their teens. We do make some kind of like adjustments or like stretchiness for youth who are in their later year, 12 year, but littles, it just doesn't, it doesn't tend to function super well for them. And we don't have a lot of supports available for the wee littles right now. So just a heads up that largely it's the adolescent folks that we can reach through that medium right now. And there is a parent group available, especially good for parents who are sort of resistant but not utterly opposed to their youth and their identity, or people who have questions, or they're confused, or even who embrace and want connection and support, because those are the folks that can get a lot out of talking to one another. What else are some takeaways?
Well, my question would be, it was stunning how it was so different. I was looking for a place where they might be stronger. But my question is, couldn't there be a questionnaire that gives them an advantage? I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, like, we're asking questions, I guess, about kids who aren't experiencing that. And so there they are out in the cold. And they must have some feeling about it, having an advantage to them. I don't know.
Karen, you want to say a few more words about that? I feel like I'm not super clear on your comment, and it seems important.
Well, I guess maybe my take would be to have a discussion with them about what they view as strengths in their situation, even though what other people see as strengths are not going to be theirs. And so
that's awesome.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Thank you for that. Strengths-based approach is really great. One of the things that's true about having a marginalized identity is that it's only marginalized because other people make it that way. Otherwise, it's just an identity, and it's probably a pretty freaking awesome one. A lot of youth who are given support around their identities really embrace who they are. You may have heard specifically with reference to diagnoses around gender issues that the DSM still contains the idea of gender dysphoria. And that is a thing that can happen for some youth who have a particularly intense disconnect with their gender and their bodies and their sense of self. But what we don't talk a lot about is gender euphoria, and the fact that there is actually a really measurable sense of relief and joy that come when youth are credited with who they are, and when the adults and their peers around them acknowledge their identities, use the names and the pronouns that they want, include them and people like them in, examples and in everyday life. There is a real sense of belonging and feeling really good and affirmed that can happen too. And so taking that strengths-based approach, what is it that you love about your identity? What is it that is special about who you are? Is a great question to ask. Not every kiddo is in a place at all times to be able to identify those things, but everyone is in a place to be reminded that those things exist. Great. Other things?
Yeah, I'm a guardian ad litem in the courts, and the children that come into our system are already traumatized in many ways, and some of it is sexual trauma. And I think it's very important that we all find ways to support them. But I also think to get out more all the various counselors who are particularly adept and sensitive to children who may, or young people who maybe already know what their sexuality and gender is or are questioning. And I have found, I have to do a shout out, how wonderful Outright Vermont is, how wonderful some of the groups have been to teens. I had one teen who I really think that person transitioned very, very well And the only question out there was the name change to really protect that child when that child became an adult, when the birth certificate was changed and the name went with it. And that was the only glitch. But I really do think that Vermont has a lot of, and some of the cognitive, you know, the DBT groups that are specifically for young people who are questioning, especially the gender identity folk, have just been superb. The trouble is, though, these kids come in already suicidal and with developmental trauma. So this is just a whole nother layer that goes on top. And I think as just someone who's in the courts, trying to make sure that we respect who they are and we don't go burrowing into them. You know, I think that's I think that what I take away, because they are so at risk, that you don't want to force them one way or the other, or say, oh, well, because you want to be an ex, obviously you aren't recognizing that blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that actually brings, I have like a list here of like gold star, really important points. Make sure you get these through before you get off of this call. And one of them is that reminder that LGBT youth have that piece as a part of their identity, but sometimes they have a tendency to either over or under emphasize it, and trying to look for that balance is really valuable. So like being LGBTQ, etc., is not the reason for all of their struggles, but it's also not insignificant to the different things that they're facing. Yeah. And there may not even be struggles. It may sometimes just be pieces of understanding themselves that are taking some time to settle in. And if we expanded our understanding that, oh, for LGBT kiddos, this might be something that we need to poke at a little bit more, raise up a little bit more. Just a good balance there. And I also wanted to put forward that a little bit further into this fall, I will be, Outright is co-hosting a series on foster to adoptive families for, we're working with the Coalition for Foster to Adoptive, I am forgetting their name, but that's basically the concept. And we're co-hosting so that we can offer some information to families who maybe have adopted a child or are considering adopting a child out of foster care and want to be prepared for an LGBTQ identity, or have an LGBTQ kiddo and want some information. So that's a good resource to know, is forthcoming within the next month or two. And that information will be available on our website calendar. And also, if you want that information to come to your inbox, you can email info, I-N-F-O, @outrightvt.org and ask to be put on our listserv. And we send out notices probably once every week or 2 weeks. They're always adorable. So even if you're used to getting clutter in your inbox you don't want all the time, it's worth looking at, promise. Okay, I also wanted to make note of some of the things in the chat, and one of those pieces that came up a lot is our ongoing education makes a difference for these folks. So it's not enough to have 1-2 hour training on supporting LGBTQ youth once every 5 to 10 years, right? The information moves fast, the youth's needs shift quickly. So one of the things that we can do as supporters is to keep up with the information, keep up with the data and the new learning that's available. And you can even keep up with kind of the pop culture. That's one of those ways that's really helpful in relationships and in sessions, even to create connection. So if you're looking for a way to connect to youth, sometimes the media that they are consuming is a good way to do that. If you want recommendations for that, I absolutely recommend Sex Education, which is a show on Netflix. I also recommend She-Ra on Netflix. Both really good new pop culture things that a lot of the kids are watching and engaging with. Even Legend of Korra, though that's a little bit older at this point. So you can really look into television shows and movies and comic series and things that youth are starting to see themselves reflected in. And a lot of them are looking to those places for affirmation. And if they're not yet, some of them don't know those things even exist. You can be the person who provides the resource to let them engage with some of that affirming stuff. All right, we're gonna pop on to our next, oh yes, Pose on Netflix. Pose is probably one of the more important television shows that's being made this decade. So if you haven't engaged with Pose yet, it is an absolutely critical look into the history and the lives of people of color who have gender identities that aren't cisgender. And it's also just brilliant and wonderful to watch. But a lot of people, even within the LGBT community, are learning things about our own history right now watching that show. And so it can be really valuable for all of the wraparound levels to be checking out the same things that we're learning alongside. All right, so back to screen share. Super thrilling PowerPoint action. Let's go. The next piece that I'm going to do is one that may take a little bit longer, so I just want to offer some recognition around that. I am going to put you into 6 groups. Actually, I lied. I am probably going to put you into way more than that, because at this point, that would be almost 10 people in a group, and that's a lot. I will put you in groups, and here's what we're going to do. If you're in, I'm going to assign you these words that are on this screen, and I'll tell you how the breakdown is going to work, since we might do a few more groups than are listed here. What I want you to do in this conversation in the breakout room is have a discussion of what about this particular identity might be important or unique or different in the experience of a person who has it, and therefore might be useful for you to know as a person supporting someone with this identity. So what are particular areas of challenge or friction that these particular folks might be encountering? What are some areas of joy or excitement that you could be diving into with them? What are some things that are specific to this identity? I'm going to run through them very fast in case you're not already familiar with these terms. So bisexual or pansexual refers to a person who is attracted to more than one gender. Gender non-binary, you might have also heard words like gender variant or gender fluid. Basically means that in the binary gender that we typically have of girls and boys, these are people who do not adhere to any one box. It could be that they are like starkly in between. It could be that they flow all over the place in terms of their identity and their presentation. Could be just that they're gender creative and they want to play with the gender blocks and not be held in. So that's gender binary. Trans femme is transgender femme identified. So you might also hear male to female. That usually refers, it's a little bit older a term, and often still gets used when we're talking about medical transition. Not all transition is medical. Lots of transition is just social, having people around you affirm who you are, use the words that you want to use, being able to dress and act the way that you want to. But femme refers to what in our kind of collective society we might identify as female or feminine. So what are some differences around people who are trans femme? Asexual refers to people who don't experience physical or sexual attraction at the same way that we often expect people to. Asexual folks may have some physical attractions, may have some interest in engaging in sexual practices with a partner, may have no interest in that, but overall that's a reduced and underemphasized part of how they engage in relationship and how they engage in intimacy with people. And often ace folks experience that almost as if they are broken because of the emphasis that we put on sex and sexuality in relationships. So that's asexual, people who don't experience as much of that physical and sexual desire. Questioning can mean wondering about my gender, wondering about my sexuality. Wondering can happen at any age. It can happen at age 5, it can happen at 15, it can happen at 94. So questioning is that wondering space, and it can happen more than once in a lifetime. And finally, agender refers to people who don't experience gender as part of their identity at all, which you can imagine in a world as heavily gendered as ours is sometimes intense. So those are the terms, and how I'm going to break that out is if you are in rooms 1 or 2, you might want to jot this down. If you're in rooms 1 or 2, you're going to do the bisexual, pansexual term. If you're in rooms 3 or 4, you're going to do gender non-binary. If you land in group 5 or 6, you're going to do trans femme. If you land in group 7 or 8, you're going to do asexual. If you land in group 9 or 10, you're going to do questioning. And if you land in group 11 or 12, you're going to do agender. Hopefully someone from your group got that down. So I'm going to open this share. I'm going to leave this share up just for a second, but remember that the shared screen will go away once you're in breakout rooms. So you'll need this information somewhere separately. And just give me a moment and I will beam you to your rooms. And if you have any questions or issues, once you're there, there is a function to let me know and ask for help. So please feel free to do that. And we are going to give this about 7 or 8 minutes in discussion, and then we're going to come back out and have a larger discussion. So let's put you in 12 rooms and off we go.
Okay, we're back.
Your mic is off, Mara.
Well, if you want to hear me talking or whatever, thank you. So thank you and welcome back. And we're just going to kind of go through groups and talk about the things that you discussed around your identities. So let's start with the groups that did bisexual and pansexual. What came up in your discussions? Feel free to unmute or put things in the chat.
One thing that came up was just the conversation of labels and how it can be really difficult within wanting to have a label, but then constantly having to fight the stereotypes of labels, especially if you take bisexual and pansexual together, because some people would say that they're different and some people would say that they are very similar. And so even within the community itself, kids struggle sometimes with that as well. And so, yeah, labels was a really big topic.
We talked about that as well. And especially that the labels can be so hard with, especially with bisexual and pansexuality being kind of easily visually erased depending on who you are with at the moment. And so kind of, but also talking about how important it is that once you find your label and once you found an identity that feels right, that you can celebrate that with someone, and kind of give them a buffer to their own, like a buffer to like the outside world by celebrating their dedication to working on themselves and figuring out something that makes them feel right in the world. But yeah, we did talk about like the erasure and the fact that it can feel, it's a, you know, if you're out in public with a boyfriend, then you're going to be viewed one way. If you're out in public with someone who appears to be one gender, you're going to be viewed another way. And if you're in a long-term relationship, it can kind of be like, well then, come on, stop sitting on the fence, just identify as what you're with your partner.
Oh yeah, big fence energy. Yeah, lots of people who are like, oh yeah, you're just on the fence. Why don't you pick a team, right? You're actually just, this is just an intermediary stage before you go full gay, right? Or you're just wondering, maybe you're greedy, you need to pick a side, right? All of those things are things that come down on people who are attracted to more than one gender. And it can be really frustrating when you've spent a lot of your time, like Kat said, finding yourself and figuring out that something is different or that something needs acknowledgement, and then to then be erased because other people don't see you you know, as your full identity all the time. Another really big thing with that one, I don't know if anyone ever touched on this. Did anyone touch on the not queer enough question? What did you talk about?
Basically the kind of way that your identity, like that if you were with like us, if you were in a relationship that from the outward appearances can be straight, you can then be like not welcome in queer spaces, and that like there isn't really like there isn't really a straight community. There isn't really like, you know, so you kind of,
we tend to frown on those parades, so yes.
Yeah, so there's not really like, it's not like you're giving up. It's not like you're like, oh cool, I'm leaving this community for this other open and accepting community. It's like you lose a part of your identity by being outwardly in a relationship that could outwardly be viewed as heterosexual. And you know, that kind of just continues to add to the erasure or the exclusion from the queer community, especially when there are so many people who put such a high standard on Gold Star Gay.
Would you explain what Gold Star Gay means, Kat?
Gold Star Gay means that you have only had sexual experiences with, depending on how iffy you get, with people who are of the same gender as you. Then there are more exclusionary definitions as well, which are really harmful.
Let me tell you all a deeply unuseful but interesting anecdote, that there is also a concept of platinum star gay that you can only receive if you were born male and are attracted to men. And that is that if you were born by cesarean section, you have therefore never experienced a vulva or vagina in your entire life. Platinum star gay, right? What even? The fact that we have conversations like that means that that feeling of like not gay enough, not queer enough to get to be in this community, I don't get to have Pride Month, do I even belong here, becomes a really big question when there are all of these people who set up weird standards for what qualifies you as one label or another. Great. That's really, really good. I'm so glad we covered the breadth of that one. Janice, were you going to say something?
This reminds me a lot of the discussions that have been going on about, even in the Black community, right? The inner workings of the Black, like you're not Black enough, you're too light, you're not, like the whole, how even people within the community can judge and question everybody else. It's in the same community when it should be more, you'd think that it'd be unified, but it's not. But it just reminded me of that, where there's this whole, I don't know, it was like a show documentary or something on not Black enough, and how within each group, there's those levels and standards. So the one you just talked of is highly entertaining, by the way.
It is. I figured I would add the entertaining antidote. And I also want to say thank you for that specifically, because this is true of many marginalized communities, how much of a thing you are and whether it's enough. And there is no objective standard. There is no, well, you are 62% gay and you are therefore welcome to come to the Pride Parade. But none of those things exist. So a question of, are you Black enough? Are you Latino enough? Are you disabled enough? Are you poor enough to get to be in any of the groups that, you know, are kind of formed to offer support to one another around shared experience, can sometimes also therefore create outgroups. So that's a conversation that at the very least you need to be capable of having with folks. And a good reminder that intersectionality is real, and intersectionality is that concept that we are more than one identity at the time, and all of those identities combined make for a different experience from any one of those areas considered by itself. So that concept originally came from Kimberly Crenshaw. And as a theorist, she was seeking to try to explain that we didn't have a word to talk about how the experience of Black women was different than the experience of Black people, was different than the experience of women, right? Like that there were very specific pieces about being a Black woman that needed consideration and discussion and acknowledgement. And since that point, we've sort of expanded that to talk about like, oh, LGBT people of color, LGBT people who have a disability, people who come from impoverished or rural backgrounds, right? All of those things end up stacking on top of each other and make for a really different experience. Okay.
Well, if you get into the issue of Hispanic, Latina, those differences then compounded with race, which is even added on, you get all those other layers. But I think it is natural for people to want to identify with a group, and people to want to label people, oh, you're with the XYZ. And if you think about the size of most of our schools in Vermont and how hard it is to find a group, whatever, you know, regardless of what your gender sexuality is, and then you take this other added layer and say, who are my allies? Who are my friends? And maybe it's okay not to have to be in that group, but you could have, I guess the word is allies now, the people you're just comfortable with. And I think that's the level you really want to somehow achieve, is the comfort without erasing who they are.
Big goals, right? So I did get a request to just kind of review the terms, and so that we know what we're talking about. Bisexual and pansexual, I did put them together because they refer to people who are attracted to more than one gender. There are some other labels that could go in there. Bisexual and pansexual are the two kind of numerically bigger ones. People do have different definitions of them. Some people view bisexual as people who are only attracted to women and men for different values of woman or man. Some people see pansexual as people who are attracted to a human but not their gender. And some people see it as people who very much pay attention to gender but are attracted to all the genders. My recommendation, which I've given in other workshops, is when you are working with an individual person, reflect their language back to them. If they use the word bisexual, use the word bisexual with them. Don't try to press a definition that you know of different words onto a person. And if someone is using a word that you don't know, or if you just want to connect more to the word that the person is using, you can ask if they'd be willing to tell you more about what they mean by that word, or what that word means to them, so that you're getting their definition that they are using for themselves, rather than a kind of pat definition from out in the world. All right, we're going to move on to gender non-binary, which again is people who do not identify as either women or men, but who identify as some variation. And it could be fluid and moving over time. It could be kind of like a split of like half girl, half boy. Could be, I reject your labels entirely and I do me. So that's kind of that gender non-binary piece. Again, we're using sort of umbrella areas to have a conversation, because if we got into the nitty-gritty of every single solitary label, we would be here for the rest of the summer, and there isn't much summer left. It's Vermont. So gender non-binary folks, what did you talk about?
Our group talked about a lot of different things. Oh, Heather, don't log out. Jump right back in. Heather, come back. And it was a really intelligent and a very in-depth discussion, and I was really happy to be a part of it. But one of the things, and Karen had mentioned this before, we really talked about was like the positives, right? The freedom of being able to identify how you want and as you want, and then also their strong sense of self. That they would have to determine on any given day or however they're feeling, where they are in their span of their life, what's going on, that they can choose to identify or not. Like what you said, they just might not want to be in a box. But we talked a lot about boxes. And Heather, jump in and add, and I don't know, who else, Michael?
Yeah, we mentioned like some of the issues that might come up for them is that society struggles on a whole of like, everyone needs to pick, like the previous topic talked about, you know, which side of the fence are you on, choose a side. It's very much like that. Society's like, are you a boy or are you a girl? And so that could be difficult for them with society and some of their peers. But I think the positive is that they do have to have kind of a strong sense of self to be able to navigate that and say their truth. And we also, someone mentioned, you know, how they can create themselves. One of the other issues that might come up is one of us had mentioned having like studies, mental health studies, scientific studies, and how they want you to identify as male or female, but like they're missing out on populations of people by not including the rest of them, and that the language changes so quickly that sometimes it's hard for us to keep up. And you've kind of already mentioned that, but that it's hard for us to keep up with what do they want to be, what do people want to be called, how do they identify, and trying to keep up on that.
Other pieces on gender non-binary?
I believe out of all of them, this is one that you would have to ask them how they want to be referred to, because it's so fluid and they're so uninhibited that it can go in any direction. So you brought up a,
sorry, go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, you brought up a good point. If you're not sure on what to call their group or what their condition is, just come out and say, pardon my ignorance, but what do you mean by that?
And this is also another place to think about our own conditioning around gender and sexuality, the way that we are really, really taught and enforced to think that everyone out there is straight and everyone out there is cisgender until proven otherwise. But if they are proven otherwise, then they better be in another identifiable box, right? Because it gets really confusing and like, fine, whatever, you're not, like, you say you were born as this, and now you say you think a different thing, fine, but you have to commit to that thing, right? So it is weird how sometimes we get in that situation. Exactly. And that makes things like pronouns and the fact that we are taught that you can look at someone and know their gender by looking at them. That is a lifelong, decades-long programming. And so it takes a lot even for us to start thinking about, well, how do I maybe not use pronouns in my head the minute that I see someone. Janice just mentioned that it can be really hard to use they, them. I want to remind you of a really good exercise to practice around they, them, and that is to remind yourself of how you talk about people when you don't already know their gender, right? So the example I often give is if, you know, we're after an event is over, there's a cell phone laying on the table, someone might say, oh, someone left their cell phone. I'm going to go out in the hallway and see if they're still there and ask if it's theirs, right? All of that is perfectly normal, natural English that we use all the time, but can be helpful for us, you know, knowing that we actually already use that construction to try to use it a little bit more generally. And this is also a good place to do a reminder that our system of politeness and formality is gender based. So, sir, ma'am, Ms., Mr., all of those things are gendered. And so for people who are non-binary, that can be really, really just a non-stop sand in their craw, you know, just like absolutely non-stop. And even for those of us who would just prefer to not have gender attached to our recognition of person all the time, it can be a challenge. So the thing that I recommend there is just to try practicing taking it out as much as possible. Try not to use sir or ma'am. Try not to describe someone as she or he unless you have specifically talked with them and know that that is the identity that they use. Sometimes it can even be helpful to practice with like animals in your life. If you practice talking about your animals with they, them pronouns, it's a way to practice without accidentally doing any ouch to people, right? Like a puppy or a cat in your life is not going to care if you are using different pronouns to talk about them. But it may very well matter to a client that you're working with, and to have some more fluidity with that might be something that you could do. All right, so gender non-binary. The next one that we had, groups 5 and 6 did trans femme. So what was that conversation?
We talked a lot about social societal norms and how, you know, specifically if someone works in an environment that is, you know, very like male conservative and they're trans femme or starting the process of learning it about themselves, trying to figure out how to navigate that environment, how difficult and how much of an internal struggle that is when the other side of the fence won't adjust their approach and their understanding of what it means for someone to be trans femme. And just how these societal norms weren't always these societal norms, but we're so stuck in them. It's very frustrating to make the, you know, the trans femme person adjust how they act because it makes you uncomfortable.
Other folks in the trans femme group? What'd you talk about? Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to chat through. But so some of the things that I think are really important to acknowledge around trans femme folks are that for people who are experimenting or experiencing a new gender from the one they grew up as, they are also experiencing the social situations that surround those genders. So for a lot of trans femme folks, they're experiencing misogyny for the first time in their lives, and they've never necessarily run into that before. And so we absolutely hear from youth who are like, I get catcalled on the street and I hate it. Why do people do that? Or people talk over me in class now, or I don't get called on. What's going on? What changed? So that can be something that's kind of unique to trans femme folks. Interestingly, a lot of folks who start to identify or at least project a more masculine image are suddenly like, oh my God, people listen to me in meetings and nobody bothers me on the street. It's great, right? So that's what I mean about the differences. You know, sometimes there are positives and sometimes there are ouches that are associated with your coming into your new identity. Misogyny also includes a real anger, frustration, confusion around men who act too femininely or want to be women, right? That is a thing in the United States that is very common. So we use femme words in order to denigrate men who are not acting the way that we want them to. So we use words like pussy, or we say you throw like a girl, or we say you're effeminate. It's the worst thing you could be, right? So a trans femme person is all but embodying this transgression that people just absolutely don't allow. And that can sometimes come with much more intense bullying, even more intense physical violence. And of the list of people who is murdered in hate crimes related to trans identities, trans femme folks are super over-identified. They are way more numerically common in the list of people who get hurt or even killed in hate crimes because of that sort of mentality around gender. So that's why I specifically like to raise up trans femme, not because all sorts of different kinds of trans identities don't experience friction, but because that additional piece of anger and frustration and hatred that come around sometimes femaleness in general, but specifically a femaleness that is not the way that people think it should be. Lots of challenge there. We'll go ahead and move on to asexual, because we're protracting a little more even than I had intended. So asexual.
Hi, everyone. So our group, again, just talked about societal norms and how you know, partnerships in our world and in this day and age are really solidified by some sort of physical connection, and how somebody who is asexual may feel like they don't have a real partnership because they may not have that specific type of connection with their partner, or they might be rejected by possible partners because when they, you know, come out as asexual, their partner is probably not used to that and has probably not had a relationship, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it may be, where there isn't some sort of a physical component or something that's going to lead up to eventually some kind of a sexual component. So we just talked about how that, you know, how people who identify as asexual may be dismissed by people in their lives. Oh, you haven't found the right person, or you haven't had the right kind of touch. That's why you maybe something happened to you when you were a child, so you just don't even want to explore that side of you. But, you know, ultimately, we just want to make sure that we validate people, whether they choose to explore themselves sexually or not.
Yeah, this is Anne, and just agreeing with what Emma was sharing with a larger group. And we talked about, or used the word erasure in considering this identity as well, and kind of the same way that it was brought up with the bi and pan identities, that so there's an additional pressure, or could be a pressure, to identify oneself, and continually to kind of out oneself, because otherwise one may not witness this identity, not have a chance to honor it or understand it. And that creates erasure as well. And then just I was acknowledging, I'll speak for myself, just really bumbling around even how to discuss asexuality in terms that weren't kind of like the absence of something, but more of, I guess that's why I'm struggling to learn more about what it does present, what it embodies, not just what it doesn't.
Absolutely. That is such a good point, that a lot of times asexual and agender people are described as almost like a vacuum, right? Like that they are an emptiness of something. And there is not a whole lot that's more demoralizing to the human brain than being described as a loss or a missing or an emptiness, right? So absolutely. And even I am, this is an area where I'm still doing work to talk about, well, what are the things that those people are and have, instead of talking about absence. One of the things that I will say is that asexuality is asexuality on the normal human sexuality spectrum. It is an actual human sexuality that real people do have. It's not abnormal. It's not diagnosable. There are a lot of people who will talk to folks who are ace. Ace is sometimes the shortened version of asexual, as if that there is some trauma in their past that caused it, or that maybe they are physically different in some way and need to be checked out. And it gets seen and pathologized that way, when it isn't something to pathologize. It is usually just someone who their sex drive is either much lower or just doesn't exist at all, or it's just very specific, right? There are people whose, you might have heard the term demisexual. Demisexual can be sometimes seen as a subset of asexuality. And that term usually refers to people who only experience physical or sexual attraction once they've created an intellectual and emotional bond with a person. So it's not that they don't have sexuality. They're not a vacuum of sexuality. It's that there are specific circumstances under which they feel those things, and other circumstances under which they don't feel them. So that's, I bring up this identity because it's so common for especially youth who say, I think I may be asexual, to be written off utterly by adults. You can't know that. You're only 14. You haven't even had a real crush yet. You haven't even finished puberty. You wait till your brain finishes, right? All of those sorts of things. And it doesn't mean that it's not worth having conversations about, like, understanding that people's needs change over time, because sometimes ace people experience a new brand of frustration or confusion if they do have a physical or sexual attraction to someone. And that's not allowed. It's more of our labels and boxing problem, right? So for people to be seen as normal and healthy if they are experimenting with or wondering about that. And for you to have that word in your pocket, because there are a lot of folks who are asexual come to that term or that identity much later in life, because they have spent their whole life just being told that they just have a low sex drive, or that there's something wrong with them, or they just assume there's something wrong with themselves. And so they haven't actually gotten a chance necessarily to be educated about the fact that it's a possibility that this is just part of who they are, and it's a normal part of the human possibilities of experience. Okay, I see a lot of chat action. Just want to check in. Okay. Yes. So I think Megan's question about offering questions, I think you can always offer questions. But I think offering questions that are about the person rather than options. So rather than say, like, well, do you think that you might be X? Asking questions about, what is it about your experience that makes you think that word makes sense? Or what is it about what you're feeling that makes you feel like that this is different somehow, right? Ask them to dig into themselves, and that's the direction to go, so that you can offer kind of comfort and range of possibility based on the person's actual experience. Okay, questioning. Who was questioning group?
I can speak to this. We talked about on the positive side, could this be if someone is identifying as questioning, that they have a sense of confidence? Another group used the language strong sense of yourself, and in a place of accepting who you are and really following your heart and having integrity towards yourself. And could it be an opportunity that you are a mentor and advocate for other people who are in a stage of questioning? And is it a time where you may be receptive to therapeutic support to offer some clarity about what's going on for you, or receiving validation and empathy and helping you to untangle your thoughts and your feelings? And then on a more challenging side, is it a place where you're sort of the other and maybe don't fit in to societal norms because you're in this place of on the fence? And could it be really a place of loneliness and fear? And are you feeling a lot of pressure to choose more certainty?
Really, on that note, thank you, Allie. That was really good. That whole piece was great. That bit there at the end, the part about people wondering about your questioning and its validity, one thing that is very common is for people who are LGBT to go through more than one identity before they find the thing that actually explains what they are experiencing. This is especially true for people who are trans or gender non-binary. A lot of times they will spend some time thinking like, maybe I'm gay, maybe I'm pansexual, I'm not really sure what's going on here. And sometimes we'll even go through the effort of coming out and trying to onboard people. And then the more they learn, the more they dive in, the more they realize that there's something else actually that makes even more sense. And they're like, oh, actually, I'm gender non-binary. It's not that just the attractions bit, it's my actual gender isn't in only one box, right? And then all of a sudden people are like, well, you just told me you were a gay. I just got used to that one. I can't like make up your mind, right? And that can be so frustrating, because I do think that a way for us to do a reframe around the idea of questioning and around the idea of LGBTQ identities in general is to view those people as people who have tremendous strength, people who have tremendous sense of self, because it is much easier to go through your life not wondering about your gender or your sexuality. There are prepackaged ones that everyone expects you to have, and if you can just have them without trouble, meh. Right? Lots and lots of us have never sat down and thought, I wonder why it is that I feel like I'm a girl. Or I wonder why it is that I feel like I'm a boy. Or how do I know that I'm straight, right? A lot of people with those identities never have to ask that question. So to even begin asking the question, to even begin diving in, requires a sense of self that deserves some affirmation, that deserves some support. Good stuff. Anything else on questioning?
So our group thought that maybe that as a either a gender identity or an orientation could be extended to other parts of your life, where you could just like be questioning about everything, which personally I think that's how you should be. It could lead to like an increased sense of curiosity. Once you do find the answers to whatever you're questioning, you feel an extreme sense of validation, and you just ask yourself a more general question like, what brings you joy? What you have the freedom to ask that, rather than just trying to put yourself in a box.
I love that. Questioning can be a lifetime journey. It can last all the years you ever existed. And that would be an okay place to be constantly wondering and noticing and observing. And that can be a really healthy outlook. So I think that is a great thing to offer folks is the, you know, like this doesn't have to feel like, oh God, I can't wait till I land on the right answer, because you might not ever feel like there's a right answer. And knowing that that's okay is also valuable. And you might stumble on to more than one answer along the way. So continuing to question has worth. Very good. And then we'll move to agender, just again, in the interest of time. Agender. People who don't experience gender as part of their experience of being in the world.
I can speak to a little bit of that from our group. One of the things that kind of stuck out for me was how, or not just me, but all of us, I think, was how little interaction we have had with anyone self-identifying as agender. Just the idea that, you know, thinking about exploring those conversations of pronouns and what that might look like and how that might make a person feel. And also kind of understanding from that other piece of us that we need to make sure that we do our own digging and our own education where we're not overwhelming somebody with teaching us about it. And really getting, because in our little group, you know, everybody was like, wow, you know, I don't really have much around that. I don't have much interaction around that. I don't have much education. I don't have much in terms of engagement. And so we were all just very tentative about that.
True facts, real stuff. That's another one of my gold star, make sure we cover this points. And that is, client time is time for them to work on them, not for you to work on your education, right? Absolutely. It is a time for you to learn about your client or patient's experience of themselves. That's absolutely appropriate, and you should be learning that thing. But if you're sort of like, oh, I've never heard of this thing in my life, get yourself familiar in that conversation with what they're experiencing, but save the asking questions about what that thing is at all for after the session. Google exists for $0.00 if you're already using an internet connection, right? So use your resources to become informed. It's great if you know what to look for ahead of time so that when someone walks through your door, you're equipped. That's not going to happen all the time. People come in with random junk all the time, and you have to go Google it after. That is totally normal, and that is an okay thing to admit to yourself and to offer to the person in real time even, is to say, you know, I'm not as familiar with that. Can you tell me what it means to you and what your experience has been so far? And I'm also going to go do a little bit of educating myself, because I feel like it's important to be able to support you to have some more information, and I don't want you to have to be the person who feels responsible for talking to me, right? It is a reality in the healthcare field that often LGBTQ people have to educate the people who are caring for them on how to care for them. And that can be a terrifying prospect, because if you're walking into a therapy appointment going, I don't really understand what's going on in here, or some things that are going on in here really could use a little bit of clarity, and you come out of the gate with, great, I don't know what's going on in there either, you tell me, no one comes back to the next appointment after that, right? And it's even more frustrating when it's like, sometimes people are having those conversations with like surgeons, right? And they're like, wait a second, I'm going to be asleep for this. If you don't know what's up, we need to not go there at all, right? So at the very least, you have available that these people should be awake through your professional session with them, and that you can be honest with them about where you are and ask them what they need. Okay, so that was awesome. Thank you for doing the deep dive on some of those questions. it's intended to be something that you can expand outwardly to all kinds of identities, all kinds of experiences that people may have. Obviously, those aren't the only 6 identities in the world, but they are ways for you to practice thinking, what are the specific challenges or frictions that this particular person might be experiencing? What are some joys or affirmations that this person could be experiencing? What are questions that this person might have? And of course, remembering that their individual questions and answers around all those things are going to be different from the next person with similar identities that you meet. So what I'd like to do in this next section is to have a conversation about some concrete things that we can be changing within our practices to make them more inclusive. So I will share this super cute slide with you. This is a collaborative brainstorm. Let's talk together. Let's throw things in the chat. Let's have a conversation about what are things that you could be shifting in your agency, in your program, in your individual practice, in your spaces, in your data systems. All of these elements that I have here are things that you could adjust. Let's start with physical space. What are things you could adjust in the physical spaces where you work that might make them more inclusive to people of all genders and all sexualities? Bathrooms. Yeah, it's great to be able to pee in a place that you're going to be stuck for a while. If you don't have a gender neutral space for people to use the restroom, it can really be an immense stressor that's happening for folks. So yeah, make sure that people have places for their bodies to exist. Language on signage. It'd be great if the bathroom just said bathroom. That's really hard to get away with sometimes. But the signage on gendered things in the space, the signage, even sometimes when we talk about the forms, the physical forms that people are engaging with, the language that we use on those, partner or spouse instead of husband or wife. What is your gender, and offering more than one of them instead of just 2. All kinds of different places that you can offer option and let people see representation, let them see themselves reflected. And that actually kind of gets into systems and like the protocols. This is a great time to also talk about the fact that sometimes you're an individual practitioner who does all your intake yourself and all of that stuff, right? End to end. Sometimes there are other humans who interact with a patient or client before you get to them. If they have already managed to ouch a person before they even get to you, you might not have that first appointment. So this is a place to talk about what are the protocols in place when we have an intake form, or when we have an intake appointment with a separate person, or even when someone who does like administrative assistant stuff is on the phone with somebody. Are they trained not to use ma'am or sir? Are they trained to offer, kind of expansion and affirmation? Do you say out loud, like we're an LGBTQ affirming practice and we strive to maintain that? All of those things are things that you can add on. What else can we do in the physical environment to create inclusiveness?
One that I just recently became aware of is that sometimes prescriptions label what the gender of the person is on directions,
Yep.
which I was shocked to see, but that could be a real easy thing to just either not use gender on things where it's genuinely unnecessary.
Absolutely. And there's places to recognize where gender might crop up that you could at least provide warning around, right? This is, again, a thing that's a little bit more relevant in other healthcare fields, but it is common for no one place to be the one-stop shop for all of a person's healthcare needs, right? So if you're going to recommend the possibility of medication, then they're probably going to end up engaging with a doctor or a nurse practitioner or or pharmacist. And if people send tests in, the test technicians sometimes are the ones calling back with results, right? So this is a place to not, you know, specific to that particular area, but overall, what are the layers of interaction that people might have as a natural outcome of what you're recommending to them, and what can you prepare them for, or what kind of recommendations can you make to those receiving entities around education, so that you know you're not bouncing somebody out of the comfortable space that you've made for them onto a concrete surface, right? Good. Yeah, I love the idea of having stickers or flags or LGBTQ stuff around, because visual affirmation matters. There are actually flags for like every single one of those identities that we talked about. So, you know, if you wanted to go really bananas, you could have like a whole UN situation in an office. All right, so that's a little bit about physical space. What about systems? We talked a little bit about forms. Wesley says here, like, since we're being asked to track gender for a funder, the forms have a blank space to fill rather than predetermined boxes, which is actually the opposite of usual funder problems, right? Because often you have to make federal reports, or you have to make state reports, or you have to make reports to a funder, and they don't give you as many gender options. It's on you to figure out how to create user end documents and engagements that are inclusive, and then you figure out how to translate that to whatever reporting you need to do. Don't put that on the client. Don't go like, oh, hey, so I have to say like how many women I saw this month. Would you say that you fall into that category or not, right? So your job is the form, is the protocol open? And what do you need to do with the information to do whatever you have to do with it on your side? And remember that sometimes it's not even paper forms anymore, right? Sometimes it's actual software. So then it becomes a question of, does your software offer the options and the openness and the affirmation that you want to be seeing? For people who work in school systems, a lot of times you're working with very specific, like Infinite Campus or Power School, right? Where like, this is the purchased software and they either have it or they don't. So find out some things about the systems and softwares and things that you're using, and find out where you can create space. And if you can't, figure out what you're going to say to offer people the reality that that space might not be there, but that you are still offering affirmation and support, even if we have to kind of do this yucky thing for a system that we can't change yet. What else in the systems area?
Can I ask, does Outright Vermont have any kind of ability in their education program to review forms or suggest when an organization is doing something to make sure it is appropriate and doesn't put people off? Do you have that ability to do that?
Folks email me with questions all the time, and a lot of times it's just that they're editing a form and they're like, we're editing the gender line and none of us know what we should put. What is your recommendation for what we put here? So yeah, absolutely, you can ask Outright at any time. Specifically if you are working with youth clients, if your agency or the things that you're working on are much more adult focused, Pride Center is often the direction to go with that. But I'm also not going to like reject a question because I'm like, well, I suspect that mainly people over the age of 18 will use this info. So yeah, Outright does provide that. And Googleable, again. I also recommend genderspectrum.org. Genderspectrum.org is a really good resource for offering all kinds of education and suggestions and information. So that can be another good place to get started with info if you're just sort of not sure where your Google search will take you. How about the question of education and training? What could we be doing there?
I think that a huge thing that can kind of come from a lot of identity stuff is that it becomes very based in academia, which can then be very hard to relate to anyone who hasn't had, 6 seminars and supplementary material, which means that a well-meaning parent or support system could get very easily lost, and thus really creating a situation in which they are speaking an entirely different language from a youth that they are trying to support and help. And so kind of creating a dialogue that we can have that helps both with the kid who has spent, 7-8 months, most of their life figuring out the terminology, that very specifically helps them, and helping bridge the gap between that and the support system that desperately wants to help them, but is having a real hard time accessing graduate level work on a 5-second pickup.
100%. It is true of not just you, but literally anyone that a client or patient comes into contact with, that they will be less familiar with the individual situation of that person, but also not necessarily educated overall on the thing that that person's even asking about. So offering space for caregivers to be asking questions, the same way how I just said, like, it is not a great idea for you to do your education by dragging it out of the person that you're working with. It is not good for family or caregivers to do that either. Their education also needs to take place outside of dragging it out of the person that they're working with. So it's great if you've got some resources available to recommend. Outright is a wonderful place to send parents, because it's a place where parents are talking to each other, and there is often work that they need to do that cannot be done without being around other people who are experiencing the same thing. A lot of times an LGBTQ kid, unlike a lot of other identities where you're like, well, we are poor in this family together, so we can talk. I have had the experiences of poverty, and I know how to prepare my child to deal with this. LGBTQ is one of those identities where it's entirely possible that the people who are raising you have never encountered this thing before and have no idea what's going on. And on top of it, have never thought of it before. And so for some parents, they are losing their imagined future of a child, right? Even if it's as simple as they've pictured a wedding day, or they've pictured grandchildren, or they've pictured what their career is going to look like. Often gender or sexuality or those details are part of that. And so that's a grief. That's a loss. That's an experience that people need to process. And the place to process it is not on the person experiencing the hard thing, right? Like, the last thing a trans kid wants is for you to say, but I named you after my grandmother. How could you give up that name, right? Like, oh God, that does need processing. It's real. That's a real feeling that families, caregivers, support people need to be able to have the conversations about areas where they're frustrated or confused or having guilt or grieving of their own. But the place to do that is not with the person that they're trying to serve or protect or take care of. And I also saw some flashing in the chat, so I'll just have a look. Invite Mara and company to present at all staff at our organization. Mara likes that idea. This doesn't have to be the only time that you have a training, right? You can do looking for more education and training work after this point. Maybe it's for other people on your staff. Maybe it's even for other people in a building where you work, right? So something that I talk actually with schools all the time about is that the people who have often some low barrier interaction, very intimate, close interaction with students are custodial staff, lunch staff, right? People who don't have a control over grades or behavior or things like that. People who can just connect as people. And if those staff aren't trained, they can make ouches too. Or if they are educated and trained, they can be providing a support that people don't even realize kids are engaging with. And the same can go of the spaces that you're in. Who is in the spaces that a youth or a caregiver might engage with that isn't specifically you or isn't specifically in your office, who also maybe could use some education and training? Tell me a little about languages and assumptions. What are some shifts that you could be making there?
I think it's really just pausing before you put on a judgment or before you label someone's gender, and really just being like, I think how you mentioned before, just it's not necessary. Like if you don't know someone and you don't know what they prefer, then to just leave it out. So I think that's a huge thing. And I know for me, I'm definitely going to be like practicing my language at home, like with my animals. So I think that's a really good suggestion. And it's just for us to keep being educated, I think is huge.
That's awesome. And I want to pair that with the recommendation in the chat that like putting pronouns in your signature block of your email. If you ever get an email from me, you'll even see that next to my pronouns, I actually have a little link that says why, and it goes to a place that would explain why I have put my pronouns there and what that's about. So it's not just visibility, but it's also an education opportunity. And yeah, in video conferences, I totally forgot to change my info, but anytime you're in a video conference or a Zoom, you can usually change your name. Here, all you have to do is you hover over your picture, you click those 3 dots, you pick rename, and then you can change it to whatever you want. I will do that right now just to show you how fast it is. Ta-da! Pronouns in my nameplate, right? Oh, good. I'm so glad, Amanda. Yeah, I actually really love that resource that I linked to in my signature block. So please feel free to borrow and steal at will. Really awesome stuff to share with people. And yeah, Brayden also mentions business cards, websites, other places that you can use inclusive language. Reduce the amount of gendered words that you use. And that goes not even just in sessions, but overall, because it helps to reprogram your brain. So rather than saying, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or when you walk into a room and say guys, and you're like, yeah, but guys is gender neutral. I always have a challenge to that one, and that is if you think that something is gender neutral, use the other gendered version of that word and see if it's still gender neutral. So for instance, if you're gonna walk in and say, guys, you wanna go outside with me or do you wanna go to lunch? If you can't walk in and say gals to the group of people who are there, then that word is not gender neutral. It's just that same male typification that we do, where we're like, everyone's a fireman, right?
And,
so yeah.
I'd like to add in terms of practicing, I have kids that I deal with, and you know, Vermont, if you say 3 sentences, they say, oh, that's Judy XYZ, that I have started always using the they, them, and never disclosing the sexuality of any kid I am working with. You know, the gender or whatever, because it is so easy to slip in and someone says, oh, that's my cousin's niece's uncle's brother, because this is Vermont. And I found it's great fun to try to be very conscious doing that. And I think that would be provided with anybody. Well, I had an interesting experience with someone the other day, and that's a very normal thing, but there is time. I think writing is what I find it's hard to use to try to do the plural, and then, you know, then you have a singular person on the other end, and that can be, yeah.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, one of the things about language is that it's intended to communicate. Yeah. So if you have to break some grammar rules here or there in order to get your point across, but also do the inclusive work, that's okay. And there's totally space to use clunky language and you can acknowledge that. You can say, you know, as I composed this email, I was trying really hard to use a gender neutral perspective. And so you may find that it's clunky at points, but I wanted you to understand what the goal was as I was composing it, right? I'm a big fan of letting people know what you were going for, because people have a tendency to open their minds to try to see what it is that you were aiming for if you tell them that it's there in the first place. Another exercise that's actually really helpful around the pronouns is you could also try using they and them for a really well-known person. So like, not to negate her actual gender identity, but anytime you talk about Beyonce, you could try using they, them, because that's, your brain does know that person's actual gender. And so it will be very similar to the mental processing required of if you have met a person before and think you know their gender, that you're not erasing Beyonce's gender. Nothing you can do will make her gender different, right? But you can teach your brain to do something different with information. So that can also sometimes be a tool, just to try to offer your brain practice, because that's all this is. This is all just practice about doing things new ways and including people in new ways. There are things that we do now that we never would have done 100 years ago, and we do them now without thinking about them. So the more that you practice them and the more that you normalize them, the more comfortable they become. What about this last one here? What would you do if you were addressing a situation where someone had a bad experience in your office or with you individually around this question of inclusion?
I had a situation like this once where it was a genuine miscommunication. And first off, the first thing I said was how brave I thought the person was for talking to me about this. And really creating an environment in which the discussion was a real discussion, and we got to have a conversation about what their interpretation was, what I had meant, some larger context as to why they had been feeling a certain way. It was about them feeling like I only talked to them in a certain manner, and I was like, well, I never talk to anyone who's in trouble in front of anyone else, so you never see me talk to anyone else like this. And so we were really able to like take it away from like the stuff that was like the hurt feeling and have a real genuine conversation that really started with how proud I was of their bravery of being able to come to me with this, and just really just having that be the basis of the conversation of really identifying it as two adults wanting to make this thing better.
I want to offer an acknowledgement there that is really important to kind of the way that human brains work. And that is that merely saying that you are inclusive or that you are open or that you can come to me with any questions does not actually provide the trust required to do that, right? Like, Kat, I would imagine in that situation, you have to have built some trust already. You have to build a relationship to have that conversation. And again, this is another place where I see like letting people know in advance as being a way to try to build toward that trust, where you can say like, I know that I am going to tell you that if I am doing something that hurts, or if I am doing something that's unhelpful, or if you really need me to know a thing, I know I can tell you that you're welcome to tell me, and that might not make any difference that I've told you that. But I want you to know that I'm really working on hearing that information. I'm really working on trying to be more open and trying to be reliably available for that input. So it's okay if it takes a little bit of time for you to build up courage to have a conversation. It's okay if you need to find another way to tell me. If it's easier to tell me written in email than it is face-to-face, do that thing. Even if it's easier to make a comment to like the organization that I'm working for, open doors for people and then offer them that like a one-to-one discussion is the way to really like get the most out of your ability to do the thing that they need and their ability to know what you are capable of, but offer them other avenues for addressing a situation as well. And being genuinely sorry is good. Making it about you is not good, right? So it would not be helpful for you to spend all of your time going, that's not what I meant, that wasn't where I was coming from. Again, like Kat mentioned, like there is a space for trying to reach understanding together so that you understand how people are thinking, so that you can use that to use it anticipatorily, right? Later, you can use it for, oh, we've had this conversation in the past. I think I can see what thought process is happening here, and that's useful. But what isn't useful is for you to go like, I took a training, I'm trying really hard, we're required, don't you see my rainbow, right? Like none of those things are gonna mean anything to someone who just experienced friction or an ouch, or who is feeling like you aren't getting them completely. So you have to put the effort into that part rather than the effort that is very common, right? You are a person too, you're a human, and humans have defensive reactions. We don't like to be wrong or make mistakes. So you also have to offer yourself space to go like, oh, you know what, I did not mean for that to happen, but that is definitely something that I can see that was a mistake, or I'm really sorry that hurt you, and let's make a plan for moving on and taking care of ourselves. Okay, so we are in our last 5 minutes, and that means thrilling query time, super exciting evaluations. So, you will see that there were some pair and share scenarios here. I don't have time to go through all of those, but we got through more today than we did last time. The nice thing is this PowerPoint will be available, and you can look at those scenarios with other colleagues. You can test them out on your own, and you'll be able, if you want, you could even request more trainings, and we could do more stuff like this together. But for right now, today is coming to an end, and the Department of Mental Health needs evaluations from you on today's training. So I have put a bit.ly link there. It's bit.ly/QU33RYAE. If you are having trouble typing that or copying that over somewhere, and you want to just reach out to me directly for that link, you can email me and I will provide you the link in a message. Super easy. And a reminder that if you have not already put your name and your agency affiliation and program in the chat, I need to be able to report who is here to the Department of Mental Health. And so name, the organization or agency that you work for, especially if it is a designated agency that works on behalf of Department of Mental Health in a county, and program within that if you work in a specific program. And I will allow you to have these last handful of minutes to fill in that form. You don't have to stay on camera if you don't want to. Remember, my last recognizing and resisting implicit bias training is this Friday, 1 to 3 p.m., same time frame if you haven't caught that yet. Otherwise, merry Monday afternoon to you, and feel free always to contact me at info@outrightvt.org with any questions, comments, or to tell me that I'm amazing. All right, have a wonderful one, y'all.